Norodom Sihanouk, the controversial King of Cambodia. Part 1. A Prince is Born. Roots of Royalty and a Nation in Waiting. On October 31, 1922, in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, amidst the grandeur of the royal court and the lingering grip of French colonialism, a boy was born who would come to embody the very soul and struggles of his nation. Norodom Sihanouk entered the world as the only child of Prince Norodom Sihanouk and Princess Sisowath Kosamak, a union that united two powerful royal bloodlines. His father, Sihanouk, descended from the Norodom branch of the Cambodian monarchy, while his mother, Kosamak, was the daughter of King Sisowath Monavong, the reigning monarch at the time. From birth, Sihanouk was destined to navigate a world where history, politics, and royal obligation would intertwine in ways few could predict. The early years of Sihanouk's life were shaped by an unusual prophecy. Royal astrologers warned his parents that he might not survive childhood if he were raised by them directly. In a culture deeply steeped in spiritual beliefs and ancestral wisdom, the prince's life took a different path. Rather than growing up in the care of his parents, young Norodom Sihanouk was entrusted to his maternal great-grandmother, Pat, a formidable matriarch within the royal household. When Pat passed away, his mother brought him to live with his paternal grandfather, Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Sihanouk, in turn, assigned the care of the young prince to his daughter, Norodom Ketkanyamam. Through this web of guardians, Sihanouk grew up not only within the confines of royal privilege, but also surrounded by a sense of duty and tradition, while somewhat distanced from his own parents. Sihanouk's formative education began at the François Baudouin School in Phnom Penh, a French colonial institution reflecting the European influence embedded in Cambodian governance and society at the time. He later continued at the Nguyen Monoram School, another French-backed institution, where he developed a fondness for academic pursuits, but an even stronger interest in artistic and athletic endeavors. Music, drama, soccer, these were his passions as a young boy, and his maternal grandfather, King Monavong, noticing his grandson's flair, personally funded Sihanouk's theater troupe and sports team. Even at this early stage, Sihanouk was developing the charisma, creativity, and leadership instincts that would later serve him, both on the throne and in the political arena. In 1936, Sihanouk left Cambodia for the first time to pursue his secondary education in Saigon, the bustling heart of French Indochina. There he enrolled at the prestigious Lycée Chassaiglou-Loba, a boarding school known for cultivating a new generation of elite Southeast Asian youth loyal to France. In Saigon, Sihanouk lived in the cross currents of colonialism and modernity. He learned the French language with fluency, adopted European customs, and was immersed in Western literature, music, and history. But his heart remained Cambodian. Though molded by French tutelage, he never shed his pride in his Khmer identity. In those school years, no one suspected the teenager would soon ascend the throne. The Cambodian monarchy, while symbolic under colonial rule, still held great cultural weight. King Monavong, Sihanouk's grandfather, reigned during a time when the monarchy's influence was slowly being diluted by French colonial administrators. Yet in April 1941, the unexpected happened. King Monavong passed away, and amidst the power vacuum, a surprising decision was made. Jean de Coup, the Governor-General of French Indochina, under consultation with the French colonial apparatus and members of the Cambodian Crown Council, selected the barely 18-year-old Norodom Sihanouk to become the next king of Cambodia. His youth, inexperience, and perceived pliability made him an ideal candidate in the eyes of the French, someone they believed could be easily controlled. But they could not have foreseen that this seemingly malleable young monarch would soon assert himself in ways that would change the destiny of Cambodia. On May 3, 1941, Sihanouk's coronation was held in Phnom Penh. The rituals blended ancient Khmer tradition with modern pageantry, symbolizing a kingdom poised between its past and an uncertain future. The French viewed the event as a formality, a decorative crown placed on a loyal servant of colonial interests. Yet Sihanouk himself understood the significance. Though young, he felt the stirrings of destiny and resolved to do more than merely wear the crown. World War II had cast its long shadow over Southeast Asia. In December 1941, just months after Sihanouk's coronation, Japanese forces swept into Cambodia as part of their invasion of Southeast Asia. French colonial control, though technically still present, was deeply weakened. By March 1945, with the tide of war turning and Japanese influence peaking, the occupiers dissolved French administrative authority in Cambodia and pressured King Sihanouk to declare full independence. To the shock of many, he did exactly that. On March 13, 1945, King Sihanouk publicly proclaimed Cambodia's independence and assumed the dual role of monarch and prime minister. A bold act that would mark the beginning of his long and complex career as both a head of state and a political tactician. Though the Japanese occupation would end later that year with their surrender, Sihanouk's dramatic declaration of independence planted a seed of nationalism that would flourish in the decades to come. But independence proclaimed under foreign pressure was not the same as independence achieved by one's own hand. Sihanouk would come to understand this deeply. As World War II ended and French colonial administrators returned to Phnom Penh, they sought to reassert control. Yet the young king, now tasting the heady mix of power and national pride, had no intention of remaining a mere figurehead. What followed was a transformation that would set the course for modern Cambodian history. A king who would abdicate to enter politics, a monarch who would become a revolutionary, and a leader whose legacy would both inspire and divide generations. This is where the true saga of Norodom Sihanouk begins. Part 2. The Path to Independence. From Monarch to Politician. By the time World War II came to an end, Cambodia had become a nation caught in a tug-of-war between its past and future. The brief and symbolic independence declared under Japanese occupation in 1945 had dissolved quickly with the return of French colonial authorities. But for King Norodom Sihanouk, now a maturing monarch in his early 20s, the illusion of passive kingship had vanished. The seeds of nationalism had been sown, not just in his people, but within himself. Even though the French reinstated their administrative grip, they soon realized that Cambodia's political terrain had changed. Sihanouk, who they once believed would be a docile and ceremonial ruler, began asserting himself in increasingly independent ways. He used his position as king to challenge French policies and voice Cambodian desires for autonomy. The tide of decolonization sweeping across Asia had reached Indochina, and Sihanouk intended to ride that wave. In 1946, only 5 years into his reign, Sihanouk took a bold step by initiating Cambodia's first modern constitution. Drafted by a joint French-Cambodian commission, the document introduced unprecedented reforms, including universal male suffrage, the establishment of a parliament, and protections for press freedom. This was a foundational moment for Cambodia's transformation into a modern political entity, and Sihanouk played a central role in bringing it to life. But constitutional reform was not enough. Sihanouk wanted Cambodia to be a truly independent nation, not just a protectorate cloaked in a facade of self-rule. The 1949 Franco-Khmer Treaty, which nominally recognized Cambodia's independence within the French Union, still left major governmental ministries in French hands. The king found this arrangement intolerable. At the same time, Sihanouk faced growing political discontent at home. Cambodia's newly formed National Assembly was fracturing along party lines. The Democratic Party, a liberal and nationalist faction supported by the educated elite, clashed frequently with royal appointees. Prime ministers came and went amid power struggles, corruption allegations, and popular unrest. In 1949, Sihanouk grew so frustrated with the political infighting that he dissolved the National Assembly and ruled by decree for 2 years. As the 1950s dawned, the global Cold War intensified, and Southeast Asia became a strategic battleground between communist and Western powers. Sihanouk skillfully used this geopolitical backdrop to Cambodia's advantage. He embarked on an international campaign to demand full and unconditional independence for his country. In early 1953, after years of diplomatic stalling by the French, Sihanouk decided to take matters into his own hands. He left Cambodia for what would become known as his Royal Crusade for Independence. From Paris to Canada to the United States, he lobbied foreign leaders and used the media to make his case. In interviews and speeches, he warned of communist insurgency, argued that Cambodia was being forced into instability by continued colonial interference, and pleaded for freedom as the only solution to peace and regional balance. His diplomatic offensive bore fruit. Sihanouk's campaign coincided with rising French exhaustion from the First Indochina War in Vietnam. Hoping to focus their resources there, and wary of global condemnation, French leaders finally relented. In a series of negotiations in mid-1953, France agreed to transfer full control over Cambodia's internal governance, including the judiciary, police, and military. On November 9, 1953, Sihanouk returned to Phnom Penh in triumph and formally declared Cambodia's independence. Crowds flooded the streets in celebration. For the first time in over 80 years, the country stood sovereign and self-governed. But this victory also came at a personal cost. While Sihanouk had earned the adoration of many, others, particularly members of the Democratic Party, were uneasy about his growing political ambition. They feared that his popularity would erode parliamentary authority and that he might seek to dominate Cambodian politics as a strongman rather than a constitutional monarch. Sihanouk, always attuned to the shifting winds of politics, understood these tensions. In a move that shocked his allies and foes alike, he made an extraordinary decision. On March 2, 1955, just 33 years old and basking in the glow of his greatest political achievement, Sihanouk abdicated the throne. He claimed that the burdens of monarchy, its intrigues, restrictions, and ceremonial constraints, were holding him back from serving his people more effectively. In truth, his abdication was a strategic masterstroke. By stepping down, he shed the limitations of royal protocol and entered the political arena as a civilian leader, yet one who still commanded deep reverence and loyalty from the Cambodian people. His father, Norodom Sihanouk, ascended the throne, but it was Sihanouk who retained the public imagination. Mere weeks after his abdication, he announced the formation of a new political movement, the Sangkum, or the Popular Socialist Community. It was not presented as a traditional political party, but rather as a national movement aimed at uniting Cambodians across ideological lines. The Sangkum would soon become the dominant political force in Cambodia. The 1955 general elections marked the beginning of a new era. With his immense popularity, control over the media, and the support of the royalist establishment, Sihanouk's Sangkum won by a landslide, 83% of the vote. The once powerful Democratic Party was wiped out. Sihanouk was appointed prime minister. Now ruling not as king but as a civilian politician, he embarked on the next chapter of his life. A chapter marked by experimentation, consolidation of power, and the pursuit of a national identity defined on Cambodia's terms, free from colonial legacy. The young monarch-turned-politician had guided his nation from subjugation to sovereignty. Yet the independence he fought so hard to win was only the beginning. Cambodia stood at a crossroads, and Sihanouk, its most prominent figure, would now be tested in new and unpredictable ways. Part 3. The Sangkum Era: Power, Populism, and Political Experiments. With Cambodia's independence secured and Norodom Sihanouk now a commoner politician rather than a monarch, the nation's political future took on an unusual trajectory, one almost entirely shaped by his charisma, vision, and determination. The year 1955 marked the dawn of what would become known as the Sangkum era, a period defined by a unique fusion of monarchy-inspired reverence, populist governance, and one-man rule cloaked in the garb of national unity. Having abdicated the throne and assumed the role of prime minister after his sweeping electoral victory, Sihanouk wasted no time transforming the political landscape of Cambodia. His political vehicle, the Sangkum, while officially a broad-based movement, operated more like a personalist party built around his persona. Open to monarchists, conservatives, technocrats, and even some left-wing intellectuals, it was, in theory, a unifying national project. In reality, the Sangkum functioned as an apparatus for centralizing power, consolidating Sihanouk's control while eliminating organized political opposition. In the aftermath of the 1955 election, Cambodia became a de facto one-party state. The Democratic Party, which had once been a vocal force in parliament, was dismantled. Its leaders were arrested, exiled, or silenced. Dissenting voices, particularly from the leftist Prakishan Party, were monitored, suppressed, and in many cases, physically attacked. The state-controlled media sang Sihanouk's praises, while political rallies turned into theatrical displays of adoration. Though Sihanouk insisted that Sangkum was above partisanship, it increasingly resembled a political cult of personality. Yet Sihanouk's dominance was not merely enforced, it was reinforced by genuine public enthusiasm. To many Cambodians, he remained the king father, even though he no longer held the crown. His dramatic personal style, frequent public appearances, and impassioned oratory created an aura of fatherly care. He positioned himself as both protector of Buddhism and architect of modernity. In a country only just emerging from colonialism, this blend of tradition and progress held deep appeal. Ideologically, Sihanouk embarked on what he called Buddhist socialism, a curious mix of spiritual values, left-leaning economic reform, and royalist nationalism. His vision was to develop a society rooted in Khmer cultural identity while embracing selective modernization. He emphasized social equality, rural development, and education, though always under strict central control. Buddhist monks were encouraged to spread the Sangkum message, and development projects were often accompanied by religious ceremonies. The fusion of political and spiritual legitimacy gave Sihanouk a unique aura among his Southeast Asian contemporaries. Women's suffrage was introduced, and the Khmer language was promoted as the national tongue, displacing French as the dominant language in government. These policies elevated national pride and identity, but they also further marginalized Cambodia's small but influential French-educated elite, many of whom found themselves alienated from Sihanouk's increasingly insular rule. Sihanouk's foreign policy during this time was equally distinctive. Declaring Cambodia's stance as one of strict neutrality, he refused to align with either the Western or communist blocs in the Cold War. However, in practice, he leaned increasingly toward the communist world, drawn by their support for decolonization and their respect for Cambodia's sovereignty. His warm relations with China's Premier Zhou Enlai and North Vietnam's leadership solidified Cambodia's place among the non-aligned nations. In 1961, Cambodia became a founding member of the non-aligned movement. His relationship with the United States, meanwhile, deteriorated. Although the U.S. had provided military and financial aid, Sihanouk came to believe that American intelligence services were working to destabilize his government by backing his political enemies. His suspicions were not entirely unfounded. CIA involvement in regional affairs was rampant, and the U.S. was openly aligned with anti-communist regimes in South Vietnam and Thailand, both of which Sihanouk viewed with growing distrust. In 1963, tensions with Washington reached a breaking point. Sihanouk dramatically severed U.S. diplomatic aid, accusing the Americans of supporting the Khmer Rouge, a right-wing anti-monarchist guerrilla group. He simultaneously nationalized Cambodia's banks and entrepot trade, centralizing economic control under the state, and establishing state-run monopolies like Sangkum to manage foreign commerce. The move was risky, alienating the business community and draining the state's financial resources, but Sihanouk framed it as a necessary step to assert Cambodia's sovereignty. Even as Cambodia became more isolated from the West, Sihanouk's ties with China and North Korea deepened. He received financial assistance, military training for his security forces, and lavish hospitality during his frequent diplomatic visits. These relationships were deeply personal as well as political. He admired Mao Zedong's revolutionary spirit and felt emotionally supported by leaders like Kim Il-sung, with whom he developed a warm friendship. But Sihanouk's independent path was not without its contradictions. While promoting leftist ideals domestically and aligning with communists abroad, he cracked down on the Cambodian left at home. In 1959, after uncovering a failed coup plot allegedly backed by South Vietnam and the CIA, he ordered the execution of his own Minister of the Interior, Dap Chuan for treason. That same year, a parcel bomb meant for Sihanouk exploded in the royal palace, killing his chief of protocol. The incident further entrenched his suspicion of foreign plots and heightened his resolve to guard against domestic dissent. By 1960, the political landscape had been dramatically reshaped. Sihanouk's father, King Norodom Sihanouk, passed away, leaving the throne vacant. Rather than reclaim the crown, Sihanouk engineered constitutional changes that created a new role for himself, head of state, which gave him all the ceremonial duties of a monarch and the executive powers of a prime minister. He was no longer a king in title, but in function, he was the most powerful man in Cambodia by every measure. Thus began a new phase of rule, one even more centralized and personalized than before. The Sangkum became not just a party or a movement, it became the state. And Sihanouk, always theatrical and improvisational in his leadership, stood at the center of it all, determined to guide his fragile nation through a dangerous world with his own hands. But the world was changing quickly. In the shadows of his rule, opposition forces, both leftists and rightists, were gathering strength. And Sihanouk, increasingly isolated and erratic in his decision-making, would soon face challenges that no amount of charisma or ceremony could hold back. Part 4, Storms Beneath the Surface, Dissent, Rebellion, and the Road to the Fall. By the early 1960s, Norodom Sihanouk was at the peak of his influence. His Sangkum Reister Neum movement dominated every facet of Cambodian politics, and as head of state, he wielded unparalleled authority. On the surface, Cambodia seemed a land at peace, isolated from the wars consuming its neighbors, full of cultural pride, with its king father appearing omnipresent in public life. Yet beneath this calm exterior, unrest was brewing, and the very foundations of Sihanouk's centralized rule began to show deep fissures. One of the most visible signs of strain was the country's faltering economy. Despite Sihanouk's well-intentioned nationalization policies and anti-corruption rhetoric, inefficiency, mismanagement, and cronyism riddled the system. State monopolies such as Sangkum were rife with corruption, enriching a select few close to the regime while impoverishing others. Cambodia's once promising rice economy began to decline, inflation soared, and resentment simmered among the urban middle class and rural poor alike. Politically, Sihanouk found himself increasingly isolated. His attempt to maintain balance between conservatives and leftists within the Sangkum began to falter. In the 1966 elections, a significant shift occurred. The National Assembly was now dominated by conservative, right-wing members who viewed Sihanouk's neutralist foreign policy and tolerance of leftist factions as dangerous. Their leader, General Lon Nol, was appointed prime minister. Though Sihanouk had initially handpicked Lon Nol to counterbalance the left, he soon found the general's independent ambitions difficult to control. In response, Sihanouk, ever the tactician, established a shadow cabinet filled with left-wing politicians to maintain his ideological balance. These included intellectuals like Khieu Samphan, Hu Yuan, and Hu Niem, who had previously been marginalized but now found themselves once again under Sihanouk's protection. But the fractures were deepening. The conservatives viewed these leftist appointments with suspicion, while the leftists, especially the more radical ones, began to doubt Sihanouk's sincerity. The tension came to a head in April 1967 in Cambodia's northwest province of Battambang. There, a spontaneous uprising erupted in the district of Samlaut, where disgruntled peasants, angered by brutal tax enforcement and abuses by local officials, clashed with government troops. Though it began as a local revolt, Sihanouk quickly suspected it was part of a broader conspiracy. He blamed the unrest on left-wing elements in his own party, particularly Khieu Samphan and Hu Yuan, both of whom had long criticized economic inequality and the military's repression in rural areas. Sihanouk reacted with fury and paranoia. He denounced the leftist intellectuals, claiming they had orchestrated the rebellion and ordered their arrest. Khieu Samphan and Hu Yuan disappeared, fleeing into the jungles to join the growing ranks of the clandestine communist movement, led by Pol Pot, which would later evolve into the Khmer Rouge. Their defection marked a dangerous turning point. For the first time, educated urban leftists were merging with underground revolutionaries, forming an alliance that would one day engulf the nation. Though Sihanouk had quelled the Samlot uprising with military force and silenced critics at home, he found himself increasingly estranged from the ideological middle ground he had once masterfully occupied. Lon Nol, backed by conservative elites and supported by growing numbers of disillusioned military officers, began to assert more independence. In 1968, Lon Nol formally requested more military aid from the United States, directly challenging Sihanouk's policy of neutrality. Though the request was initially rebuffed, it was clear that the American-aligned faction within the Cambodian government was growing stronger. Sihanouk's relations with China also began to fray. In 1967, the Chinese embassy in Phnom Penh was caught distributing pro-Maoist propaganda to Cambodian Chinese communities, material that praised China's cultural revolution and encouraged class struggle. Fearing the destabilizing potential of this rhetoric, Sihanouk threatened to shut down Chinese organizations and accused China of meddling in Cambodia's internal affairs. Zhou Enlai, China's premier and Sihanouk's longtime friend, was forced to personally intervene, instructing the embassy to submit materials to Cambodia's information ministry before circulation. It was a rare moment of visible strain in their relationship. Despite this diplomatic tension, Sihanouk still saw China as a more trustworthy partner than the United States. In a dramatic gesture of attempted reconciliation with the West, he invited Jacqueline Kennedy to visit Angkor Wat in 1967, hoping that the widow of the late U.S. president might be the key to resetting Cambodian-American relations. The visit was cordial and widely publicized, but little changed. Sihanouk remained deeply suspicious of the United States, particularly its Central Intelligence Agency, which he believed had orchestrated several assassination attempts and coup plots against him. This suspicion seemed vindicated when in 1959, a parcel bomb addressed to Sihanouk exploded at the Royal Palace, killing his chief of protocol. Though the bomb was traced to an American military base in South Vietnam, no official link to the U.S. government was ever confirmed. Still, Sihanouk's fear of foreign interference, particularly from the U.S., Thailand, and South Vietnam, grew stronger, further isolating him from Western influence and pushing him closer to communist allies. Meanwhile, the fragile peace of Cambodia's countryside was unraveling. With American and South Vietnamese forces pushing the Vietnam War deeper into the jungle, Viet Cong units began using eastern Cambodia as a sanctuary and supply route. In 1969, Sihanouk entered into a secret agreement with North Vietnam, allowing them to receive Chinese arms shipments through Cambodia's port at Sihanoukville. In return, the Vietnamese communists paid Cambodian troops to supply their jungle outposts with food and other provisions. The United States, now led by President Richard Nixon, saw this arrangement as a threat. Without informing Sihanouk, the U.S. launched a covert bombing campaign in March 1969, codenamed Operation Menu, targeting suspected Viet Cong bases in Cambodian territory. Entire villages in the eastern provinces were wiped out, displacing thousands of civilians and stoking deep resentment toward both the Americans and the Cambodian government. Sihanouk protested, but privately admitted that he had little control over the situation. The bombing only accelerated the instability. Viet Cong forces dug deeper into Cambodia. Khmer Rouge recruitment grew in tandem, fed by rural anger and the disillusionment of left-wing intellectuals. At the same time, Sihanouk's economic reforms, such as nationalizing trade and opening state-run casinos to generate revenue, were producing mixed results. Urban unemployment rose, bankruptcies and suicides spiked. The once adoring public was growing weary. In early 1970, Sihanouk departed for France on a medical trip. He had left the kingdom many times before and assumed he would return as usual, but this time his absence proved fateful. While he was away, his deputy prime minister, Sisawath Sirik Madak, and Lon Nol seized the opportunity. As anti-Vietnamese protests erupted in Phnom Penh and mobs torched the Vietnamese embassies, the two strongmen began consolidating support within the National Assembly. On March 18, 1970, they engineered a vote to strip Sihanouk of his executive powers. The King Father, the Liberator, the head of state who had led his country to independence and ruled for 2 decades, was suddenly overthrown in absentia. The Cambodia he had tried to hold together with charm, diplomacy, and balancing acts was slipping away. And now in exile, he would be forced to make the most consequential and controversial decision of his entire life. Part 5, From Monarch to Revolutionary, Exile, Alliance with the Khmer Rouge, and a Nation in Flames. March 18, 1970, was a date that would forever alter the destiny of Cambodia and that of Norodom Sihanouk himself. As Sihanouk recuperated at a luxury resort in the French Riviera, sipping tea and meeting foreign dignitaries, a political earthquake was shaking Phnom Penh. The Cambodian National Assembly, under the direction of Prime Minister Lon Nol and Deputy Prime Minister Sisawath Sirik Matak, voted to remove Sihanouk as head of state. The official justification, his negligence of national interests and growing alignment with communist forces. To the public, the action was presented as a patriotic necessity, an effort to restore sovereignty and curb Vietnamese incursions into Cambodia. But to Sihanouk, it was a betrayal of the highest order. He had been deposed not by foreign colonizers or distant enemies, but by his own ministers, by fellow Cambodians, some even from the royal family. When Soviet officials broke the news to him in Moscow as he prepared to fly to Beijing, Sihanouk was stunned. As he later admitted, he wept in disbelief. But the exiled monarch wasted no time mourning. With Zhou Enlai's support and guidance, Sihanouk immediately began plotting his return to relevance, not as a king, but as a revolutionary leader. On March 23, 1970, just days after the coup, Sihanouk delivered a broadcast from Beijing that electrified the Cambodian countryside. Speaking with emotion and fire, he called upon the Cambodian people to rise up and resist the traitors Lon Nol and Sirik Matak. He declared the creation of the National United Front of Kampuchea, FUNK, a resistance movement composed of royalists, leftists, and communists who opposed the new republic. While the broadcast had limited reach in Phnom Penh, it reverberated like a divine decree across rural Cambodia, where Sihanouk was still revered as a near-godlike figure. In his message, Sihanouk shocked the world by aligning himself with a group that had previously operated in the shadows, the Khmer Rouge. Formerly known as the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the Khmer Rouge had existed in obscurity, building a rural insurgency under leaders like Pol Pot, Ieng Sary, and Khieu Samphan. Until that moment, they had struggled to gain mass support, but Sihanouk's endorsement transformed their fortunes overnight. Villagers who had no interest in Marxist ideology but adored their king father began joining the resistance in droves, believing they were fighting to restore the monarchy and Sihanouk's vision of national independence. The Khmer Rouge, in turn, wrapped themselves in the royalist flag, presenting themselves as protectors of Sihanouk's legacy. It was a strategic alliance, one born of necessity and mutual convenience, but it would prove disastrous in the years to come. On May 5, 1970, Sihanouk officially formed the Royal Government of the National Union of Kampuchea, GRUNC, a government in exile with its headquarters in Beijing. He took the position of head of state, while the Khmer Rouge leaders accepted subservient roles, at least on paper. China, North Korea, North Vietnam, and several other socialist states immediately recognized GRUNC as the legitimate government of Cambodia, while Lon Nol's new Khmer Republic found support from the United States, South Vietnam, and other anti-communist allies. Sihanouk, now draped in revolutionary robes, became a strange and sometimes contradictory figure. In Beijing and Pyongyang, he lived in well-appointed guest houses, lavish even by Western standards, equipped with private cinemas, banquet halls, and pools. But behind the luxury, he was consumed by the mission of returning to power. He traveled extensively, lobbying governments and giving passionate speeches at international forums like the United Nations. His charm and fluency in French and English gave him a powerful platform, and he used it to denounce the Lon Nol regime and its Western backers. Meanwhile, Grunk fighters, largely composed of Khmer Rouge cadres and Sihanoukist loyalists, began waging a brutal civil war inside Cambodia. In the jungles, Pol Pot's troops advanced steadily. Though they operated under the Grunk banner, their vision for Cambodia was increasingly diverging from that of Sihanouk. While the former monarch believed he was leading a nationalist revolution to restore Cambodia's integrity, the Khmer Rouge were laying the foundations for a radical communist utopia that would soon consume the country in fire. In February 1973, Sihanouk made a harrowing journey from Hanoi to the Khmer Rouge-held territories inside Cambodia. Accompanied by Khieu Samphan, he traveled along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, crossing mountains and dense jungle terrain under constant threat of American bombing raids, part of Operation Freedom Deal. Despite the danger, Sihanouk insisted on making the trip to demonstrate solidarity with his people and the resistance fighters. He visited temples like Angkor Wat and Bante Shre, reaffirming his emotional connection to Cambodia's cultural soul. That same year, Cambodia's capital, Phnom Penh, was under siege. Lon Nol's republic was hemorrhaging funds, losing support, and fending off attacks from increasingly emboldened Khmer Rouge forces. The Americans provided military aid, but the Nixon administration was also distracted by the unfolding Watergate scandal and the slow unraveling of their position in Vietnam. Cambodia became a forgotten front in a larger war. In 1975, as the Khmer Rouge closed in on Phnom Penh, Sihanouk's position was increasingly symbolic. Still, he remained the face of the Grunk, and in April, when the capital fell, he was held aloft by the victors as a triumphant returning leader. On April 17th, the Khmer Rouge entered Phnom Penh to the cheers of weary citizens, many of whom, unaware of what was to come, believed they were about to witness a return to peace and the restoration of their beloved King Father. But what followed was anything but peace. Sihanouk was flown back to Phnom Penh in triumph, only to realize that the Khmer Rouge had no intention of restoring the monarchy or allowing him real power. He was appointed as head of state once again, but the position was strictly ceremonial. In September, he returned briefly to inter the ashes of his mother, but soon left the country once more, traveling the world to secure diplomatic recognition for democratic Kampuchea, the new regime led by the Khmer Rouge. When he returned to Phnom Penh on December 31, 1975, he presided over a constitutional meeting, but it was clear that his presence was now purely ornamental. In early 1976, he toured the countryside and was horrified by what he saw. Forced labor, emptied cities, and entire populations relocated to agricultural communes. The Angkar, the shadowy name given to the Khmer Rouge leadership, was remaking the country according to its radical vision. Sihanouk's symbolic reign ended abruptly when he submitted his resignation in protest. The Khmer Rouge initially rejected his resignation, but later accepted it, retroactively dating it to April 2, 1976. Sihanouk was stripped of all authority and placed under house arrest in the royal palace. He had once been the liberator of his people, then their revolutionary leader. Now he was a prisoner in his own land. The tragedy of Sihanouk's alliance with the Khmer Rouge had become evident. Though he believed he could harness their strength to return to power, he had instead become their hostage, and the very people who once revered him were now perishing in one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Yet even in captivity, Sihanouk would survive. As Cambodia descended into darkness, his story was far from over. Part 6. Captive Monarch, House Arrest, Vietnamese Liberation, and Return to Resistance. By 1976, Norodom Sihanouk's role in Cambodian politics had been reduced to that of a ghost. Once the architect of independence and the country's most powerful symbol, he was now a man imprisoned in his own palace by the very revolutionaries he had helped return to power. After resigning as head of state, his titles swiftly and quietly erased by the Khmer Rouge regime, Sihanouk disappeared from public life. The Angkar, led by Pol Pot, had no more use for him except as a hostage, a silent emblem of legitimacy hidden behind closed doors. For the next 3 years, Sihanouk lived in confinement within the walls of the royal palace in Phnom Penh. The conditions were not brutal by Khmer Rouge standards. He was given food, clothing, and a small staff. But he had no freedom, no contact with the outside world, and no knowledge of the atrocities unfolding beyond the palace gates. His family members were not so fortunate. Of Sihanouk's many children, siblings, and close relatives, at least 18 perished under the regime. His wife, Monique, and their children, including Norodom Sihanouk, were also under house arrest, their fates hanging by a thread. As the months dragged on, Sihanouk's repeated pleas to be allowed to leave Cambodia were denied. He feared for his life, and for good reason. He knew what the Khmer Rouge were capable of. Even as they invoked his name in official ceremonies and revolutionary propaganda, their grip on the country grew more monstrous. Entire cities had been emptied. Intellectuals, artists, monks, and former civil servants were being executed. Rice fields became mass graves. The country that Sihanouk had ruled with theatrical flair and paternal charm was being dismantled, cell by cell. By late 1978, the Khmer Rouge's reign of terror had begun to provoke a powerful external response. Tensions with neighboring Vietnam, which had been escalating for years due to border skirmishes and ideological rivalry, finally exploded into war. On December 22, 1978, Vietnamese forces launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia, determined to topple the Khmer Rouge regime and end the genocide. As Vietnamese tanks closed in on Phnom Penh, the Angkor scrambled. They relocated Sihanouk from the royal palace to an apartment in the city's outskirts, unsure of what to do with him. On January 1, 1979, the ailing and demoralized former monarch was moved once again, this time to Sisophon, a town near the Thai border. There he remained under Khmer Rouge watch, unsure if execution awaited him or if he might be rescued. Just days later, on January 5th, Sihanouk was suddenly flown back to Phnom Penh to meet with none other than Pol Pot himself. It was their only recorded face-to-face meeting. Pol Pot, now facing imminent defeat, attempted to reassure Sihanouk that the Khmer Rouge could repel the Vietnamese. It was an empty promise. The next day, January 6th, Sihanouk was quietly evacuated from Phnom Penh by air, this time not as a prisoner, but as a guest of Beijing. On board a Chinese military plane, he was flown to the safety of China, his protector since the earliest days of his post-coup exile. He landed in Beijing on January 7, 1979, the same day that Vietnamese troops captured Phnom Penh and officially ended the Khmer Rouge's rule. Though the nightmare of democratic Kampuchea was over, Cambodia remained in turmoil. The Vietnamese installed a new regime, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, PRK, led by former Khmer Rouge defectors such as Heng Samrin and Hun Sen. The country was ravaged by war, famine, and displacement. And once again, Norodom Sihanouk found himself in exile, this time not as a deposed head of state, but as a man whose name had become entangled with the darkest chapter in his nation's history. In February 1979, Sihanouk traveled to the United Nations in New York, where he addressed the Security Council with uncharacteristic solemnity. His voice trembled with pain and conviction as he condemned both the Khmer Rouge for their crimes and the Vietnamese for violating Cambodian sovereignty. It was a politically risky double denunciation, but one that reflected his desire to reclaim moral authority. Cambodia, he insisted, must be free not only from genocide, but from foreign occupation. He returned to Beijing afterward, settling once more in the comfort of the Diao U Thai State Guest House. There he entered a new phase of life, more reflective, more cautious, but no less determined to remain relevant, and he would not remain idle for long. In March 1981, determined to reassert his political influence and rebuild Cambodia's shattered national identity, Sihanouk established a new political party, the Front Uninational pour un Cambodge indépendant, neutre, pacifique et coopératif, or FUNCINPEC. Its name was a mouthful, but its mission was simple: to create a Cambodian resistance rooted in neutrality, peace, and royalist ideals. Unlike the brutal Khmer Rouge or the communist-aligned PRK, FUNCINPEC aimed to offer an alternative that was at once nationalist, moderate, and rooted in Sihanouk's legacy. To complement the political front, Sihanouk helped form a small armed force known as the Armée Nationale Sihanoukiste, ANS, composed mostly of royalist exiles and defectors. He appointed Intam, a former prime minister from the Khmer Republic era, as its military commander. However, Funcinpec lacked both manpower and international military support. For that, Sihanouk reluctantly turned once again to China and to the Khmer Rouge. Deng Xiaoping, China's powerful leader, saw Funcinpec as a potential tool to destabilize the Vietnamese-backed PRK regime. He encouraged Sihanouk to cooperate with the Khmer Rouge and the non-communist Khmer People's National Liberation Front, KPNLF, led by Sun San. For Sihanouk, the idea of allying again with the Khmer Rouge, whose crimes he had publicly denounced, was repugnant. But in realpolitik, ideals often yielded to necessity. In June 1982, after prolonged negotiations brokered by Deng and Singaporean leader Lee Kuan Yew, Funcinpec, the KPNLF, and the Khmer Rouge agreed to form a tripartite government in exile, the Coalition Government of Democratic Kampuchea, CGDK. Sihanouk was appointed its president. Though deeply skeptical of his co-leaders, he agreed to lend the coalition his name and international stature, viewing it as the only viable path to eventually restoring Cambodia's independence. Ironically, Sihanouk, the monarch turned revolutionary turned captive, was now back at the helm of a resistance movement. From his diplomatic suites in Beijing and Pyongyang, he launched a second wave of global advocacy for Cambodia. His aim was to keep the PRK from gaining legitimacy at the United Nations, while portraying the CGDK as the rightful representative of the Cambodian people. For the next decade, Sihanouk would remain in this strange political purgatory. He had no land, no palace, and no army under direct command. But he had the one thing no other Cambodian leader possessed: unrivaled symbolism. He was still the King Father, the face of the nation in exile, and for many ordinary Cambodians scattered in refugee camps or living under occupation, he remained the personification of continuity and hope. And as the Cold War began to thaw in the late 1980s, new possibilities would emerge, ones that might bring him back not just into Cambodia, but onto its throne once again. Part 7, The Diplomat in Exile, Peace Talks, Paris, and the Path to Restoration. By the mid-1980s, Norodom Sihanouk had become an emblem of enduring resilience in Cambodian politics. From palace to jungle, from king to captive, and from revolutionary to statesman once again, his identity had always bent with history's arc, but never broken. Now in his 60s and still living mostly between Beijing and Pyongyang, he watched as the Cold War that had shaped so much of his country's suffering began to thaw. And with this shift came a new opportunity for peace and perhaps for return. Vietnam, which had installed and sustained the People's Republic of Kampuchea, PRK, after toppling the Khmer Rouge in 1979, was starting to feel the weight of a long and expensive occupation. The Soviet Union, its main ally, was struggling economically under Mikhail Gorbachev's reformist agenda. Regional powers like China and ASEAN, meanwhile, were applying diplomatic pressure to resolve the Cambodian crisis. For the first time in years, the geopolitical conditions were tilting in Sihanouk's favor. It began with a personal overture. In December 1987, a historic and unlikely meeting took place in the French town of Fère-en-Tardenois. There, Sihanouk, clad in a warm scarf and heavy coat against the winter chill, met Hun Sen, Cambodia's young prime minister and former Khmer Rouge defector, who now led the PRK. The two men were ideological opposites, separated by generations and by bitter history, and yet they talked. What followed was a series of secret meetings and exchanges between Sihanouk and Hun Sen. Though mistrust lingered on both sides, they shared a goal: ending the war and bringing stability back to Cambodia. These early talks laid the foundation for a broader peace process, one that would soon expand to include all four major factions: the royalist Funcinpec, the Republican KPNLF, the Khmer Rouge, and the PRK government. In July 1988, the first round of multilateral negotiations was held in Jakarta, Indonesia, organized by the ASEAN countries and known as the Jakarta Informal Meetings, JIM. These early sessions made little concrete progress, but marked the beginning of a new diplomatic phase. For Sihanouk, it was a vindication. After years of isolation and marginalization, he was once again at the center of Cambodian affairs. The process gained momentum. In July 1989, French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas and Indonesian Foreign Minister Ali Alatas opened the Paris International Conference on Cambodia. For the first time in decades, the Cambodian factions and international stakeholders gathered to discuss a peace plan that could end the conflict and establish a power-sharing government. Sihanouk, as always, took center stage. He was no longer just the former king, he was now the face of reconciliation. At the same time, Sihanouk made an unexpected move. In August 1989, he resigned as president of Funsimpec. It was both a symbolic and strategic gesture, one meant to emphasize his neutrality and his commitment to national unity above political partisanship. Though he remained an active presence in the party, his message was clear. Cambodia's survival mattered more than personal ambition. The real turning point came in 1990 when the United Nations proposed the creation of the Supreme National Council of Cambodia, SNC, an administrative body meant to represent the Cambodian people during the transition period before full elections. Sihanouk was unanimously chosen to lead it. The choice reflected his enduring symbolic status as a unifier, a national patriarch, and the only figure who could claim legitimacy across political divides. The SNC was later enshrined in UN Security Council Resolution 668, giving it international legal standing. This gave Sihanouk an institutional role once more, and more importantly, it provided a framework for UN involvement in overseeing peace and elections in Cambodia. On October 23, 1991, a date now etched into Cambodian history, the Paris Peace Accords were signed by 19 countries in the four main Cambodian factions. The agreements called for a ceasefire, disarmament, repatriation of refugees, and the establishment of a transitional authority led by the United Nations. The goal, free and fair elections, and the restoration of a legitimate Cambodian government. Sihanouk, who had traveled from Beijing to Paris for the signing, was at the forefront of the ceremony. His presence reassured nervous diplomats and brought a sense of continuity to a country long fractured by war. At nearly 70 years old, the King Father, who had once abdicated to enter politics and later taken up arms in exile, was now the respected elder statesman who had outlasted them all. Shortly afterward, on November 14, 1991, Sihanouk returned to Phnom Penh for the first time in 13 years. It was a moment of high drama. Hundreds of thousands of Cambodians lined the roads from Pochentong Airport to the Royal Palace, weeping, cheering, and waving flags. In an open-top limousine, Sihanouk stood alongside Hun Sen, now officially his political partner, waving to a city that had changed but had not forgotten. Despite the public euphoria, the peace process was far from complete. The United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, UNTAC, established in 1992, faced enormous challenges. Most notably, the Khmer Rouge refused to participate in disarmament and began boycotting key parts of the peace agreement. They suspected the process was a trap to marginalize them, and their retreat into the jungle reignited fears of renewed conflict. During this turbulent period, Sihanouk remained a balancing force. He split his time between Siem Reap and Phnom Penh, traveling often to refugee camps and resistance zones to personally encourage cooperation with the UN. Ever the performer, he used charm, symbolism, and his legendary capacity for persuasion to bring factions to the negotiating table. In many ways, he was Cambodia's informal ambassador to itself. In early 1993, with elections looming, Sihanouk temporarily departed again for Beijing due to health concerns. While there, he proposed a new model for the future Cambodian government, a presidential system with him at the helm. The idea was quickly rejected by the Khmer Rouge and other factions who feared a return to authoritarian monarchy. Bowing to pressure, Sihanouk shelved the proposal and reaffirmed his support for constitutional democracy. On May 23, 28, 1993, the Cambodian general elections, organized and supervised by UNTAC, finally took place. It was a historic moment, the first multi-party election in the country's history with international observers present. The results were striking. Funcinpec, now led by Sihanouk's son Norodom Sihanouk, emerged as the victor, narrowly beating Hun Sen's Cambodian People's Party, CPP. But the peaceful transfer of power was not to be. The CPP, dissatisfied with the results, threatened secession and destabilization. In a bid to avert another crisis, Hun Sen and Ranarida appealed to the one person both sides trusted, Norodom Sihanouk, and once again the King Father answered the call. On June 3, 1993, he announced the formation of a provisional national government with himself as head, flanked by both Ranarida and Hun Sen as co-deputies. Though the move was met with some resistance, especially from Funcinpec, who felt their victory was being diluted, it effectively diffused the crisis. The following day, after international pressure mounted, Sihanouk rescinded the provisional government and deferred to the Constituent Assembly. Still, the message was clear. Sihanouk was indispensable. On June 14, 1993, in a ceremonial session of the Constituent Assembly, he was reinstated as head of state. 1 month later, he presided over the drafting of Cambodia's new constitution. By September, it was agreed. Cambodia would return to constitutional monarchy. On September 24, 1993, a formal declaration restored Norodom Sihanouk to the throne, marking the beginning of his second reign as King of Cambodia. Part 8, The Return of the King, a symbol reborn in the twilight of power, 1993-2004. On September 24, 1993, amid fanfare and historic symbolism, Norodom Sihanouk ascended the throne for the second time in his extraordinary life. The return of the monarchy, enshrined in Cambodia's new constitution, was not merely ceremonial, it was an act of national healing. After decades of war, occupation, genocide, and chaos, Cambodia had restored its king, and with him, the illusion, if not the reality, of unity and continuity. But this was no longer the absolute monarch of the past. Cambodia was now a constitutional monarchy. The real power rested with the coalition government, led by his son Norodom Sihanouk of Funcinpec and Hun Sen of the Cambodian People's Party, CPP. They served as first and second prime ministers, respectively, a unique and uneasy arrangement, created as a compromise to resolve the political gridlock of the 1993 elections. Sihanouk, meanwhile, resumed his role as King Father, protector of the nation, and moral arbiter, but with few formal powers. His return was greeted with overwhelming joy. The streets of Phnom Penh were once again adorned with royal flags, crowds filled public squares, and temples rang with ceremonial prayers. For ordinary Cambodians, the reappearance of Sihanouk symbolized not just stability, but a return to cultural identity. Even those born long after his first reign knew his name, revered his image, and regarded him as the nation's living link to a golden past. Yet Sihanouk soon discovered that his new reign would be filled with challenges. Though admired, he was often ignored by the powerful men who now ran Cambodia's government. Within months of his restoration, he found himself clashing with both Ranarida and Hun Sen over key policy issues, particularly their exclusion of the Khmer Rouge from peace-building efforts. Sihanouk believed that reintegrating the Khmer Rouge into political life, while controversial, was necessary for true reconciliation. But both prime ministers rejected the idea, citing the group's continued intransigence and history of atrocities. Frustrated, Sihanouk proposed the formation of a national unity government in which Funcinpec, the CPP, and even the Khmer Rouge could share power under his leadership. Again, the proposal was rebuffed. Slowly, Sihanouk began to realize that while his symbolic authority was immense, his practical influence was dwindling. In July 1994, his son Norodom Chakrapong attempted a coup against the government. The plot failed, and Chakrapong took refuge in a hotel before government troops surrounded him. It was Sihanouk who intervened personally. negotiating with government officials to allow Chakrapong to flee into exile in Malaysia. Later that year, another of Sihanouk's relatives, Norodom Sihanouk, was accused of plotting to assassinate Hun Sen. Sihanouk again stepped in, using his influence to protect Sihanouk from possible execution by ensuring his exile to France instead. These events left the king visibly weary. His dream of serving as a bridge between Cambodia's warring factions was unraveling. The once loyal Funcinpec party, now sharing power with the increasingly dominant CPP, was weakening. Meanwhile, Hun Sen's influence was growing rapidly, both politically and militarily. From 1995 onward, Sihanouk began expressing, both publicly and privately, a desire to abdicate. He voiced particular frustration over being treated as a figurehead while the country descended once again into political infighting. The coalition government was crumbling. Tensions between Ranariddh and Hun Sen were escalating, especially over appointments to lower-level positions in government and military. By early 1997, the alliance had become unworkable. And then, in July, a political earthquake struck. Violent clashes erupted in Phnom Penh between forces loyal to Funcinpec and the CPP. What began as a series of standoffs soon escalated into full-blown street battles. Ranariddh fled the country. Funcinpec was effectively dismantled. The CPP, with Hun Sen at its helm, emerged as the dominant political force in Cambodia. From the royal palace, Sihanouk watched in anguish. Though he condemned the violence, he stopped short of calling it a coup, as Funcinpec supporters did. When the National Assembly named Ung Huat as Ranariddh's replacement, Sihanouk reluctantly accepted the change, but made it clear that he had not sanctioned the events that had brought it about. The king's desire to abdicate resurfaced stronger than ever. Yet each time he raised the issue, Hun Sen discouraged it, likely recognizing that the monarchy continued to lend the state an aura of legitimacy and historical gravitas. Despite the political turbulence, Sihanouk remained deeply engaged with the Cambodian people. He began publishing monthly bulletins in which he commented on government policies, historical events, and even his personal memories. In them, a mysterious figure named Rom Rith would often appear, an alias used to deliver sharp criticisms of government corruption and authoritarianism. Many, including his son Ranariddh, believed Rom Rith was a pseudonym for Sihanouk himself. Though the king denied it, the writings carried his unmistakable voice, witty, scathing, and deeply nationalistic. He also maintained an active public life, attending cultural ceremonies, religious festivals, and charity events. He promoted Buddhist education, supported humanitarian efforts through the Samdech UV team, and even performed occasional musical concerts at the palace. Ever the artist, he remained a prolific composer and filmmaker, occasionally premiering short films or sharing old cinematic works from the 1960s. But his health was deteriorating. Sihanouk had battled diabetes, depression, and cancer since the 1960s. By the early 2000s, he was making frequent trips to Beijing for medical treatment. Though he continued to issue royal decrees and receive foreign dignitaries, he increasingly delegated responsibilities to his trusted advisors and aides. In private, he confided that he felt out of place in the new Cambodia, politically marginalized and physically declining. In July 2003, another political deadlock arose when the CPP failed to win the two-thirds majority required to form a new government. Funcinpec and the Sam Rainsy party boycotted the swearing-in of parliament, threatening to plunge the country into crisis once more. Sihanouk, ever the mediator, urged compromise. When the parties threatened to defy constitutional procedures, he warned that he too would boycott the opening session of parliament. His pressure worked. The ceremony was held and the stalemate eased, but only temporarily. By mid-2004, Sihanouk had had enough. Disheartened by repeated political deadlocks, ignored by the power brokers he had once mentored, and plagued by illness, he declared his intention to abdicate once again. In a letter dated July 6, 2004, he formally asked the Royal Council of the Throne to begin the process of selecting his successor. The move was met with sorrow and disbelief. Many hoped he would reconsider, but this time, the King Father was resolute. On October 14, 2004, the Royal Council convened and, in a unanimous vote, chose Sihanouk's youngest son, Norodom Sihanouk, a quiet and gentle former ballet dancer and cultural diplomat, to become the next king. 2 weeks later, on October 29th, Sihanouk was crowned as the new monarch of Cambodia. Sihanouk, now officially retired, assumed the post-abdication title of Preah Karuna Preah Bat Samdek, Preah Norodom Sihanouk Preah Mahaviraksat, the king father of Cambodia, the great heroic king. He moved permanently to Beijing, where he would live out the rest of his life. But even in retirement, he remained a figure of unmatched reverence. Part 9. The Final Years. Death of a Monarch, Legacy of a Nation. Norodom Sihanouk's retirement in 2004 marked the end of an extraordinary political career that had spanned over 6 decades. Yet even in withdrawal, the King Father remained a towering presence in Cambodian life. From his residence in Beijing, where he received continuous medical care, Sihanouk continued to watch over his nation with deep concern, offering occasional commentary, heartfelt messages, and reflections steeped in history, sorrow, and love for his country. Though no longer on the throne, Sihanouk retained immense respect. Cambodians across generations continued to refer to him as Samdek Yuv, the revered King Father. He still represented something more profound than politics. He was a symbol of identity, the living thread that had endured through colonialism, monarchy, war, dictatorship, genocide, exile, and finally rebirth. In his final years, Sihanouk's health deteriorated significantly. He battled lymphoma 3 times, in 1993, 2005, and 2008, alongside long-standing issues with diabetes and depression. He traveled between Cambodia and China regularly, undergoing treatments in Beijing while occasionally returning to Phnom Penh to make public appearances or attend official ceremonies. Each visit was met with warmth and reverence, as the people gathered by the tens of thousands to glimpse their beloved monarch. Despite his ailments, Sihanouk continued his creative passions. He composed music, wrote poetry, and posted personal updates and reflections on his official website, often including photos from Cambodia's golden era, political musings, or sentimental notes to the Cambodian people. He never lost his flair for performance nor his love for cinema and song. Even as his physical presence faded, his spirit remained very much alive in the nation's consciousness. In 2008, Sihanouk revealed that he had only modest personal assets, just a small home in Siem Reap and a savings account in a French bank. He emphasized that his residences in China and North Korea were not his, but guest houses provided by the respective governments. His humility in this regard stood in contrast to the often opulent image of monarchy. For many Cambodians, it was a final sign of his sincerity. A man of immense historical weight who had not enriched himself, but rather lived for his nation. His last public appearance came in October 2011 on the occasion of his 89th birthday and the 20th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords. Frail but dignified, Sihanouk stood beside his son, King Norodom Sihanouk, and Prime Minister Hun Sen. That moment, capturing past, present, and future, was a poignant tribute to a man who had shaped his country's destiny more than any other. Then in early 2012, Sihanouk returned to Beijing once more for treatment. On October 15, 2012, just 2 weeks shy of his 90th birthday, Norodom Sihanouk passed away from a heart attack at 1:20 a.m. Beijing time. The news of his death sent Cambodia into deep mourning. King Sihanouk, Hun Sen, and a delegation of officials flew immediately to China to bring home his body. When the plane landed in Phnom Penh on October 17th, over 1 million Cambodians lined the streets in silence as the royal cortege made its way to the palace. The government declared a week of national mourning. Black ribbons adorned every building, monks chanted prayers in every village, and television broadcasts replayed moments from his life. But it wasn't just the government or the palace that grieved. It was the people, rural farmers, urban merchants, elderly citizens, and young students who mourned as though they had lost a grandfather. They had. Sihanouk's funeral took place in February 2013. His body lay in state for 3 months at the royal palace before a 6,000-meter funeral procession carried him to the royal crematorium. The ceremonies, rich in Buddhist tradition and Khmer symbolism, were among the grandest Cambodia had seen in generations. On February 4th, his body was cremated. The next day, a portion of his ashes was scattered into the Chaktamuk River, where the Tonle Sap, Mekong, and Bassac rivers converge, an ancient and sacred place. The rest was placed in a stupa built next to the Independence Monument in Phnom Penh. A bronze statue of Sihanouk, surrounded by lotus pillars, was later unveiled in his honor. In the years since his death, Norodom Sihanouk's legacy has continued to spark debate, reverence, and reflection. Historians and scholars have struggled to define him. Was he a hero, a survivor, a dreamer, or a tragic figure? The truth is, he was all of these. He was the man who brought Cambodia its independence from France, the king who abdicated for democracy, the politician who played Cold War superpowers like a master conductor, the exile who fought against his own ouster, the monarch who witnessed the genocide of his people and the death of his own children, the artist who composed songs for his beloved wife and shot films about his homeland, the statesman who, in his final act, helped bring peace to a shattered country. His alignment with the Khmer Rouge during the 1970s remains the darkest stain on his record, and one which even his most ardent admirers struggle to explain. But most accept that Sihanouk never truly grasped the full horror of what was to come. He too became a victim, imprisoned, humiliated, and robbed of those he loved. And yet, as scholar David Chandler noted, Sihanouk never stopped being Cambodian royalty, not just in title, but in spirit. He belonged to his people. He danced their dances, sang their songs, told their stories, and wept for their losses. He was, as the Guinness World Records once noted, the royal who held the most state roles in modern history. But to his people, he was simply the heart of Cambodia. For generations, Sihanouk embodied the hopes and fears of a small nation caught between giants. Through monarchy and republic, communism and capitalism, exile and return, he remained more than anything a symbol of Cambodia itself, battered, beautiful, complex, and proud. As the Khmer saying goes, when the king dies, the land weeps. And in October 2012, Cambodia wept not just for a monarch, but for an era that died with him.